In Moldova, Maya Sandu, the outgoing pro-European candidate, won the elections thanks to the vote of the Moldovan diaspora in Europe. But if you only look at the votes from Moldova, she would have lost. What is also important to know is that for the 500,000 Moldovans living in Russia, I believe there were 1 or 2 polling stations, and they only sent out 10,000 ballots, and then obviously Europe welcomed this pro-European result. In Georgia, where there have also been terrible struggles for influence, the ball fell on the other side, rather pro-Russian. So there, we were outraged, we supported the protests. I think Europe has a problem with democratic principles. I don't know if they still know what a democratic principle is.
What bothers me the most is when the millions of Europeans are used to influence public opinions in the countries of these Europeans. Ever since the European Union has been in the hands of Madame Ursula von der Leyen, who has turned into a kind of war machine, all these visits, it's sitting on leopards. It's more than a war frenzy with her, as I feel it. Frankly, I was very, very disappointed because in the end, Europe could have avoided this war. Trump is not wrong.
I don't know who is driving the others' radicalization, because there are Palestinian movements that didn't need the Israeli extreme right to already reject the very prospect of an Israeli state. The first thing that comes to mind is the population of Gaza. They have been trapped since 2007.
Between the Hamas anvil and the Israeli hammer that strikes very strongly.
More than 1 year ago, the International Court of Justice spoke of a plausible risk of genocide. The natural course of things leads either to pure and simple ethnic cleansing. The intermediate step is to confine the Palestinians in a kind of large prison, like Gaza was, but a little smaller. This is the intention of the people who are in power today, and which is probably even supported after the terrible shock of October 7th, by a majority of the population who say, we will never be able to live with these Palestinians around us.
Jean-Daniel Ruch, George Martin, hello.
Hello.
We are very happy to have you back again on the Antithèse channel, but this time both of you. We first received you separately, so here we are, this time for a discussion together. Now, before we start, I remind our listeners not to forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and activate the bell to not miss any of our news. It's free and it helps us a lot. Follow us also on our other channels, Instagram, Substack, Spotify. Thank you very much for your support. Now, gentlemen, could you briefly introduce yourselves? Maybe Georges first, and then Jean-Daniel.
Yes. So I am a former Swiss diplomat, retired today since 2017. It's the beginning of my retirement. It went by very quickly, by the way. I traveled a bit around the world to focus on the essentials. I was ultimately Deputy Secretary of State at the FDFA for a few years. That was the very end. And then, before that, I was ambassador in Indonesia, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, etc. Otherwise, I started my career in South Africa. That's where I picked up certain habits, which prevailed until the end of my career. That is to say, I was not very diplomatic because in South Africa one cannot be neutral between apartheid and so on. So I had the chance to be in positions where indeed something was always happening. I was never in Luxembourg or in calm countries like that.
Jean-Daniel?
So, I resigned from the Confederation service at the end of 2023. At the time, I was an ambassador in Turkey. Before that, I was an ambassador in Israel, ambassador in Serbia, countries where nothing happens. Unlike George, I preferred calm. And then, among the interesting things I did in my professional life, I was at one point the special representative of Switzerland for the Middle East, thus responsible for promoting the two-state solution at a time when Switzerland had a small special role. And then perhaps the most fulfilling moment of my career was with Carla Del Ponte at the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where we managed to convict about 90 war criminals.
Did you both work together in the Department of Foreign Affairs or elsewhere, in other Confederation departments or even abroad?
Never directly, but we often crossed paths. I remember particularly when we both worked under Madame Calmiret. I was always very impressed by Jean Daniel's activities related to the Middle East. They were returning from very confidential meetings with Hamas, particularly because it was his mission. I believe that some held it against him, resented him in an utterly ridiculous way, but he had to do his job. And there you have it. He has always been, for me, the example of the modern diplomat, that is to say, who thinks outside the box, as they say, who steps out of his office and who was perfectly happy precisely when he was not in his office.
I always told my young colleagues, if you spend an entire day in your office, it means you're a bad diplomat.
So let's maybe start by talking about Eastern Europe, a region particularly tumultuous these days. So let's start with Serbia, perhaps. There are demonstrations, riots against the government happening there. Could you tell us a bit more? Is it a popular revolution? A color revolution?
So, I think it's not a color revolution. I was there during the revolution of 2000, which was a real revolution. And it was a color revolution in the sense that there was a genuine popular movement against Slobodan Milosevic, also linked to the economic situation, but which was naturally heavily fueled by the West. It is said that the Americans spent around 75 million to support this revolution. Here we are in a completely different situation. Here, I don't see despite what the government says, I don't see the hand of Soros or the hand of the Europeans or the hand of the CIA inside there. It's really a movement that comes from within, from the ground, that is indigenous and first sparked by a deep disgust with the endemic corruption that prevails in the country. Let's say it's practically always been there, but it has found an illustration that made people react during the collapse of the roof of the newly renovated Novi Sad station, which caused 15 or 17 deaths in November. And that is the result of corruption, because then it was realized that millions had disappeared. And then it was realized that probably if these millions disappeared, it is because they saved on cement. In construction, which is quite typical in cases of corruption like this. And so it's because of that. So the people behind this corruption system have a criminal legal responsibility for what happened there. And then obviously what people are demanding is justice. It's justice first. Now Vučić is very preoccupied because he confessed, he arrested people, they launched proceedings, his government resigned. But it's a whole system of which he is the keystone that would disappear if the true culprits were punished.
What is surprising, however, is that the demands of the protesters are not... For me, you obviously know the situation from the inside, but it's not very clear. We don't really know what they want. They want a new government. They want to put an end to the... It would be against the political class in that case, this rebellion.
It's really against corruption. So they are very cautious, and I believe they have learned from past demonstrations because this kind of demonstration is recurring. But when you have at least 300,000 people in the streets of Belgrade last Saturday, these are people who know why they are coming to Belgrade. They came from all over the country, to protest. And it's a protest against a system. Now they have been very careful not to have a leader.
It's true that we cannot identify an organization or individuals leading their revolt.
So it is intentional. It is intentional. It is an extremely horizontal collective. Moreover, they constantly change the people to avoid giving the opportunity to the regime to slam them, either in the media, because almost all the media are controlled by the regime, or through intimidation actions by the police, or like that. So it's extremely well organized. All of this is very calculated and frankly very well done. There is an ability to mobilize among these Serbian people that is admirable, When I see our students here, I tell myself that, well, they are doing little things, but compared to what we see in a country like Serbia, it's a student movement. I don't know how many people are active daily in this movement. The universities have been closed since the month of November. Vučić was counting on fatigue, as has happened in previous years. And what is remarkable is that this movement has lasted since November and shows no signs of weakening. So, if we want to compare to the year 2000, to show the students' ability to mobilize, there was a student movement that was also at the origin of that revolution in 2000. And the student movement called Odpor, Resistance, had 75,000 active members. I don't know if you can imagine what that means. 75,000 active students participating in actions across the whole country. I don't know how many there are now, but this shows that there is a genius for organizing this kind of popular revolt in Serbia, from which our own students would do well to draw inspiration if they really want to make a difference, whether it's in the field of the environment, Palestine, or who knows what. Those people in Serbia know how to organize to push a cause.
Palestine, they did it in Switzerland.
It was miserable compared to what we see over there, right? And then afterwards, they were scolded a little in the universities, so they got scared.
Do you think this massive Serbian movement could be co-opted by organizations defending the interests of the West, or NATO, since Russia is also defending the Serbian government?
So, Europeans are very awkward. Well, they are awkward on many subjects. I think we'll see that later. But they since always practically, since Vučić came to power, it has been more than, 13 years now, the Europeans rely on him as a pillar of stability in the Balkans. We rely on Vučić to keep Kosovo more or less stable, to keep Bosnia more or less stable. We know there are tensions, but he can use his influence with the Serbs in Kosovo, with the Serbs in Bosnia, to prevent crossing certain lines. So we have always relied on Vučić since he came to power, saying, he's a guy who ensures stability. Moreover, Vučić has met the Europeans' demands concerning Ukraine. So obviously he has a rather pro-Russian rhetoric, but he delivers weapons to Ukraine, he sells weapons to Ukraine, either directly or indirectly, so the Europeans are not unhappy about that. And then above all, thirdly, Vučić is very willing to give concessions to German companies for the mines of lithium, despite a popular revolt. By the way, the previous protests were linked to opposition from environmental groups opposing the mining of lithium in a valley that is reportedly idyllic. So, the Europeans are satisfied. With Vučić, they have no reason to want to overthrow him, and especially as we said earlier, what is the alternative? Replace him? Yes, but with whom? That is the question being asked in the chancelleries, and for the moment, we do not see the Western chancelleries promoting a possible opponent to Vučić, whereas in previous revolutions, notably in 2000, the Americans had conducted a very careful field study and already knew, even before elections were announced, whom they were going to back, because they knew it was the person who had a chance of winning even a moderately rigged election.
And so these lithium mines are used for electric car batteries in particular. Therefore, there are strategic interests concerning minerals in this region.
It's the German automotive industry. Nothing more, nothing less. So to protect themselves against competition from Chinese cars, what the Europeans did last summer is that they massively increased tariffs on Chinese cars. I believe it's from 18 to 39%, something like that, because the German automotive industry cannot compete against Chinese electric vehicles. And then lithium is obviously the crux of the matter in this question. And it could be a source that could somehow save the automotive industry.
It would be cheaper to get it in Serbia than in Congo. Indeed, where there are or even in South America, where there are...
Or in Russia.
Or in Ukraine. But there, I think others will serve themselves. That's why Volkswagen is making tanks, Panzers now, maybe.
So another region that is getting a lot of attention is Romania, right? So since at least last winter, with the recent banning of certain candidates, including the favorite Georgescu. Do you think it's a clear denial of democracy, as George Martin perhaps?
Well, here too, I know less than my colleague and friend. But yes, Romania is somewhat the showcase we present for, suggesting that there should be interventions. Moreover, some also speak in this context about Serbia, saying it's the same thing, but you've convinced us otherwise. But it's true that the statements by Thierry Breton, by some people in Brussels, have nevertheless raised some questions. About the Romanian case, the creation of, I believe it is one of the largest NATO bases. I mean, all this,
in Constanta,
the coincidences are so obvious that I think without falling into conspiracy, we have the right to question foreign interventions via the Romanian judicial system. I mean, a denial of democracy. I don't know, I have an idea what you think. Maybe it's gone too far, but there it is. It's complicated now to make a definitive judgment because we don't have all the evidence in hand. We don't know exactly. But when Thierry Breton suggests that after all, we could do the same in Germany, if the FT becomes a little too dangerous, there are still, in my opinion, from Brussels, some signals that are in my view, concerning from the standpoint of normal functioning of democracies, certain countries that stand in the way, let's say like that, of such things, of European politics in general.
I think we can speak of a denial of democracy at least as long as the Romanian judiciary has not provided evidence, truly convincing reasons for which these elections were annulled. Romania, for me, we can really look at the situation in Romania through the lens of the relationship Europe, Russia, Ukraine. Romania, unlike Serbia, is truly an extremely important pawn in the Western setup vis-à-vis Russia. We've talked about the Constanta base, of course, but there is another important element, which is that it is also one of the routes for exporting Ukrainian grains. And then thirdly, the opposition candidate, in a sense, has been deprived of their victory. He had not kept secret his opinions close to those of Orban and Fico ultimately. Can Europe really afford that after Slovakia and Hungary, a third country, this one even closer to Ukraine, like Hungary, a neighbor, takes a position that is between neutral and pro-Russian on that matter? So I see the strategic interest from Brussels, which is completely different from what concerns Serbia. It might seem a bit paradoxical, but I would say that in Serbia, Europe would have an interest in Vučić, somehow regaining control of the situation. However, in Romania, there they have other interests, and there they really have no interest in ensuring that the dominant team or the outgoing team remains in place as well. But it seems difficult to me. I don't know how they will do it, because if we look at the polls, the elections take place. The first round on May 4th, the second round on May 18th. Georgescu is banned, has become ineligible. But there is another candidate who replaced him, named George Simeon. And then, over the past few weeks, his ratings are rising. He's leading the pack.
It is a candidate who aligns with Georgescu.
Completely. George Simeon, I believe he has 31% in the polls today, plus 7%, whereas the candidates of the outgoing power are at 23, 24%, and rather losing momentum. What are we going to invent, or what are we going to do? I think Europe is really facing a challenge, a dilemma, and then we don't know what the Americans really want. I haven't seen an American stance. Is Trump still interested in this issue?
Not yet, in any case, I
But
feel.
it's possible not even that. It's possible that Trump tells himself, I want to disengage. It's a European problem. Why are we spending all this money to maintain this permanent base? Quite possible. It would fit his line of thinking.
I don't know why they all call themselves George. Georgescu, George, etc.
George Martin, George Bush.
I think the question, you have asked the real question, is that on one side, Europe wants to have a policy of power, but it is very complicated. When we look at the Romanian case, they do not fully control it, but they still manage to attract cameras on them. The upcoming elections in Romania will be monitored, and it will be very complicated and difficult for Europe, because during the last ones, in the end, it could still act, I would say, behind the scenes at the limit, if it really acted, which is probably the case. But now, this time, all the signals coming from Brussels are under the spotlight.
Last year we had two cases, Romania's neighbor, Moldova, and then a bit further away, Georgia, these countries that are torn between the East and the West. And there we had a splendid example of the European double standard, which shows that what drives European policy is more a matter of interest and power than a policy of respect for democratic values. In Moldova, Maia Sandu, the pro-European incumbent candidate, won the elections thanks to the vote of the Moldovan diaspora in Europe. But if we look only at the votes in Moldova, she would have lost. Now, what also needs to be known is that for the 500,000 Moldovans living in Russia, I believe there were 1 or 2 polling stations, and they sent only 10,000 ballots, isn't it? So there too, there is a kind of denial of democracy. And it's only thanks to that that she barely managed to win. And then, of course, Europe congratulated itself on this pro-European result. In Georgia, where there have also been terrible struggles for influence, but where the ball fell on the other side, more skeptical towards Europe and more pro-Russian. So there, we were outraged. We supported the protests. So I think Europe has a problem with democratic principles. I don't know if they still know what a democratic principle is.
If they already knew. That's the question.
Yes. So listen, I was involved when I worked at the OSCE in establishing the election observation methodology. So we actually knew what a real election was. So there was the whole issue of legislation, administration, possibilities of appeal, access to media, to information, and then on election day, ensuring there was no intimidation and ballot stuffing. But we had fairly clear criteria to know how to manage an election, then how to say if an election was free and fair, or if there were any shortcomings. But today I feel like we have lost that compass, because the only thing that we're actually blinded by what started in 2022 probably, which is this kind of, this phobia. What should we call this? This fear, this phobia, this anxiety about the Russian, or this anti-Russian frenzy.
Russophobia,
Yeah,
I will say.
we might call it Russophobia. But I believe this Russophobia is rooted in real issues. And then we can't blame the Balts or the Poles for being afraid of the Russians.
What is interesting is that ultimately the Romanians, the Slovaks, the Hungarians...
They know them very
They know them
closely.
very closely. During the Soviet periods, they were confronted with the same Russians. And yet it seems to me, at least in Romania, that democracy is very strong against the European system, against the Americans.
But you have the same situation in Germany. The former East Germany really knew the Russians. If there are people who have known the Russians, it's them. They are much more understanding, and I wouldn't say they are pro-Russian.
It's not understanding, but relaxed.
Relaxed. And then finally, they have relations with the Russians that are calm, complementary.
But not the Poles.
But not the Polish, exactly.
Last night, I went for a drink at the local cafe. There was a Romanian woman there who has been living in Switzerland for 20 years. And then I asked her what she thought about what was happening in Romania. And roughly what she was telling me is that the golden age of Romania was Ceausescu. I couldn't believe it. I still tried to tell her yes, but still, the destruction of the old city, the palace, all that. But no, there is such a... It's hatred that was coming out it was such hatred towards what she told me. What she said equated to kleptocracy, a kind of kleptocracy in power. And then that's where I find some similarity with what's happening in Serbia. A deeply corrupt system that has already caused a siphoning of wealth upwards, and inevitably a lot of feelings of injustice among the population. And it results in this type of behavior, the protests in Serbia and the anti-system votes in Romania.
And in the act of delivering weapons to Ukraine and financially supporting a country at war. Maybe the population also realizes that it leads somewhat to the impoverishment of the country.
Not in Serbia, on the contrary.
No, but in Romania?
In Romania, it's different. But even in Serbia, it benefits some, those who sell weapons. And it's mostly the Europeans who are paying for these weapons. So I think that is not an issue. In Romania, in principle, Romania should still benefit from grain trade with Ukraine.
But among the
But there is the energy, obviously, the price of energy that affects all of Europe.
Of course. But among the former Soviet satellites, there is truly a trend between the Poles, the Balts. For them, their feeling towards Russia is quite clear. And then there are the others. We haven't talked about Bulgaria, but in Bulgaria as well, there isn't this widespread Russophobia, etc. We don't have it in Romania, as you pointed out. And then what is also sure is that all the regimes that succeeded those Soviet regimes are often extremely corrupt and perceived as such by the populations. That is what ultimately constitutes their weakness. But among the general population, there is not that Russophobia that we see in other parts of Europe.
Would we be witnessing a civilizational split between the Orthodox world and the Catholic Protestant world?
Is that indeed the real demarcation?
I hate these theories about the clash of civilizations.
Yes, but wait. It's like in your Jura canton. Between the Protestants, the Catholics, we always talk about this line. I remember being at the end, just a few years, maybe two, before the end of Czechoslovakia. We were with the former president of the Confederation, René Felbert, with Ravel, the president who shared with us, we didn't quite realize his concerns about a breakup of Czechoslovakia. He explained to us. And then his advisor, we were at the table eating, his advisor drew this on the paper tablecloth. A line between Orthodoxy and Protestantism in Europe, which crossed. And his explanation was indeed that beyond the wars of religion, it was no longer about that, but that it had nevertheless shaped populations. I believe you don't need to hesitate to mention these dividing lines, because I think in people's minds they are still very real.
I think in the Jura it's different, but well, yes, we won't talk about the Jura.
The Jura topic is a slippery subject.
Just to remind you, the leader, the Robespierre of the Jura separatist movement, without whom there would be no canton of Jura, was the Protestant Roland Beglen. And then the icon of the anti-separatists was Geneviève Moine-Aubry, a Catholic from Agen.
So my whole framework collapses.
Not really, because there is some truth, but it is more complicated.
Perhaps we are taking another step geographically close to Russia by talking about Ukraine. So indeed, a lot of current events in this region, with negotiations between the United States and Russia in Riyadh. Where do we currently stand in this matter?
So, I think it's, in my opinion, it's very complicated, because everyone understood that Trump is very unpredictable. We can't really... Because what he thinks one day or in the morning is not necessarily what he will think in the evening. But on the other hand, what I am convinced that Trump somehow managed to overturn the Oval Office table in the White House, and that he overturned many things we thought were set in stone, this unprovoked war, etc. All this ultimately makes it allowed, and then obviously these special relations with Putin. What's interesting, by the way, is that the newspapers today or yesterday say that he scolded Putin, that he would be furious with Putin. But that very evening, he reminded that he would still talk to him, etc. No, I think there was a phenomenon, nonetheless, in the United States with Trump, let's say it like that, which has somehow considerably overturned things, removing certain certainties. Moreover, European Atlantists, even in Switzerland, we realize that these people are like orphans. They no longer know. They feel abandoned by the grandpa, by the patriarch. And it still somehow makes me think that there is a window of opportunity, as we say in Franglish, which could still open up and lead to something, well, after 3 years of war, something positive, as long as we consider peace and the cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, sorry. There I'm going a bit too fast. As something positive.
So I completely agree with Georges. A real revolution took place in Washington on January 21st.
Since 2022, the word peace was banned from American lips.
It's a bad word.
Contacts had been cut with Moscow. And then the revolution, it's first about talking peace. And then one of the first initiatives that the Trump administration took was to talk directly with the Russians. So that's a true revolution. And then, obviously, it left the Europeans, how to say that politely,
Faced with their contradictions.
Their pants down. Is that what you meant to say?
Yes, I wanted to say that even a bit more bluntly. The Europeans are lost. Exactly. Now, where I am not sure the Trump administration anticipated correctly is that Putin has time. And Putin does not want a ceasefire at any cost. He is not at all cornered, while the others are cornered. However, Putin realizes that he has goodwill from Washington that he should not waste. So he has to learn to manage Trump in a way that doesn't alienate him to continue the process. That's probably why Moscow accepted already a kind of ceasefire, 2 partial ceasefires, one on strikes against electrical or energy installations, and then one in the Black Sea. Well, in my opinion, it's already to give Trump something to say, yes, yes, no, but look.
With conditions?
We are acting in good faith.
We are showing goodwill, but fundamentally, Putin has not given up on anything at all, not on regime change in Kyiv, nor on territorial claims, nor on disarmament of Ukraine. And then he even added an additional condition by saying if there are security guarantees, they will not be security guarantees offered by European troops. NATO or European, that remains to be seen because there's still the Turkey-Switzerland option, which could be Switzerland will provide 200 soldiers according to our outgoing army chief, but why not? But why not? If it is within the framework of a ceasefire agreement or a peace agreement, I would have no problem with it. On the contrary, I would find that our army would be of use. So I don't find it completely stupid. But what I mean is that there is still a long way to go. And then now a requirement that wasn't really there earlier, rather, certainly not in 2022, when the negotiations for a first ceasefire were taking place in Istanbul. Now Putin is demanding new elections in Ukraine. Because, as he says, and he has some reasons to say it from the perspective of the Ukrainian constitution, Zelensky no longer has a mandate.
So what is truly the situation about that? Since some say that in the Ukrainian constitution, during a state of war or a particular state of tension in the country, it is not mandatory to hold elections.
As we know, when a state of emergency is declared, you can do whatever you want. It's a bit like in Switzerland during COVID.
But things are also evolving on that front. We hear that Zelensky might organize early elections. Well, not early, since he no longer has a mandate, but this summer still. So I think Trump really stirred things up, as you said first, by stopping treating Putin as someone untouchable. So he is completely acceptable, and this also causes progress in Ukraine, things we didn't necessarily expect, and we'll see. But I really think anything is possible, because as Jean-Daniel, you point out, Putin hasn't conceded anything. Putin has time, Ukraine less so, And I think that Trump doesn't have time either, because Trump promised, not concerning Ukraine. He's not worried about Ukraine, but he's worried about his promises.
He was talking about 24 hours at the
Yes,
beginning.
the 24 hours are already long past, but still, I think no one would blame him if he brought peace, the cessation of hostilities within 6 months. But I still believe that my deep conviction is that Trump is not a man of peace. We'll talk about the Middle East. We see enough of it to make one sick. More than enough in the Middle East. He is not a man of peace. Even if the Nobel Peace Prize, like Obama, would theoretically interest him, I think he is not on the path to being a peace president among American presidents. There haven't been many, moreover. But on the other hand, still, I think that on Ukraine, he has a sort of fixed idea. He has a compass, and for now, in any case, he hasn't shown any sign of letting it go.
I still see this somewhat in the China, Russia, United States triangle. It seems to me he wants to play his Kissinger.
But do you really think that Trump thinks on that level? On the level of Kissinger, do you think?
Yes, I think that, I think we tend to underestimate Trump's intellectual abilities. All right, he's a megalomaniac, he's narcissistic, he's everything you want, but he's far from being an idiot.
No, I have never considered Trump as an idiot. Moreover, I think that to be elected twice as President of the United States and under the circumstances in which he was elected, you cannot be an idiot. But I wonder if he has this approach, this very high-end strategic vision, I would say, like Kissinger. Well, so much the better, so much the better. What is certain to me is that he is much better surrounded now than he was during his first term.
But the question is, doesn't he especially want seeing the current disarray in Ukraine to recover some of the resources injected in the form of raw materials? Isn't that his primary objective?
Yes. With Greenland, that's what I don't understand, I would tell them. How do you understand this obsession of Trump with rare earths, with Greenland? He kept saying that he absolutely needs Greenland, as if the energy future of the United States depended on Greenland. How do you explain that? We didn't see it during the first term. We didn't even see it during the campaign, but now he's really making it a fixation.
So I think it's necessary to separate the issues a bit. For me, Greenland is a different issue from the issue of
Ukrainian.
From Ukraine and Russia. I think with Russia, there is a genuine desire to try to separate Russia from China and bring it closer to the United States. For that, obviously, peace must be made in Ukraine. But the range of negotiations is much broader. It's also about the price of energy, about access to certain Russian resources. For the Russians, it's about the lifting of sanctions or certain sanctions. It's about the potential return of Russia into the international banking system. So the range is really very broad, with discussion points where we don't know everything and don't hear everything. So I think that's extremely important, because he is obsessed, but he is obsessed with China. Because for him, but not only for him, for the neocons, I believe there are a consensus within the American political class to say, if we want to maintain our supremacy in the world, the rival is China, not Russia. However, if we succeed in allying with Russia, with its immense territory, strategic positions, and inexhaustible resources, then obviously it places us in an extremely favorable position compared to China. I think it's a very simple reflection, but it's not a new reflection. Well, Kissinger and Nixon at the time had done a bit of their reflection in the opposite direction, with the opening towards China. But I think we need to see it within this triangle: Greenland, Panama and Canada, because we must not forget that he mentioned these three, let's say, annexationist ambitions at the same time. That is linked, however, to the relationship with China. And here it's about controlling maritime communication routes, because with the climate change, there are already, but there will be even more in the coming years. The northern route through the Arctic, which will be open for maritime trade from China to Europe, which reduces from 9 to 15 days the travel time. Instead of going through the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, obviously, the current trade routes for transporting Chinese goods to Europe and elsewhere, well, they are completely controlled by the Americans or the Anglo-Saxons, because, those mandatory passages, it begins with the strait of, first it starts by leaving China, China feels landlocked on its maritime front because you have American military bases in Japan, you have Taiwan, you have Korea, you have the Philippines. Then there is once we have passed there is the Strait of Malacca. Then I'll shorten it a bit, but you have Bab el-Mandeb, Djibouti. Then you have the Suez Canal. Then you have to pass off the coast of Cyprus and Malta, where there are also NATO bases. And then it ends with Gibraltar. So if you want to disrupt communication routes, break Chinese maritime communication lines, for the Americans it's very easy to do. Through the Arctic, it's not possible. They cannot do it. So this Arctic route already, it is cheaper, it is faster. And then it is not under American control. And that's where Greenland and Canada have strategic positions to try to control at least part of a section of the Arctic route. So for me, that's the strategic interest of Greenland. And then there are the rare metals, yes, but I'm not sure that's the interest first. And then Panama, it's the same logic. The Chinese were in or have largely taken control of the Panama Canal, which is obviously another essential artery for international trade.
It's a company from Hong Kong that now, I believe, has sold its shares.
Precisely. They are opposing the sale.
Really? No, but...
Exactly. That for me is that
the essentials, because Anglo-Saxon power for 500 years and American for a little over 100 years has been about controlling maritime trade routes. And this control is now being endangered by the new trade routes, whether it be the one being constructed within the framework of the One Belt, One Road initiative, or now with the opening of the Arctic route. So for the moment, I believe it is usable for about 3 months per year. It is estimated that by 2030, it will be usable 6 months per year. The Russians have built a fleet of icebreakers, 41 icebreakers, more or less recent. And then the Americans have built one icebreaker since the Second World War. So they're the Sino-Russian condominium or the BRICS start with a slight head start. And for me, it is through this lens that we should view what is happening with Greenland and Canada.
Me? I hear you well, but I still really follow you, and I willingly follow you. But Trump is a super strategic genius, because frankly, it's such a strategic shift in what you describe regarding the United States that it feels like Trump, but then exceeds all his predecessor presidents by far. He would have an absolutely incredible vision. So you were a little bit puzzled. Who are the people around him? How can this shift be explained? Obama's already wanted and talked about this pivot towards Asia, this shift. But now, with the Arctic, with all these addictive men, does Trump really think about all this in his everyday policy?
Already he has...
He's a businessman. He's someone who wants to make deals, someone who has done business and all
yes. But this is someone who understands power dynamics very well.
That's for sure.
And then he does have think tanks behind him. The Heritage Foundation, obviously, they are hardline Republicans, but they are people who know how to think in terms of interest, in terms of power. After that, I'm not sure that Steve Bannon also has a long-term strategic vision. I'm not sure he is still somewhere in the system. What I'm quite sure of is that it is not Mr. Haxet, Mr. Rubio, or Mr. Waltz who have this strategic genius.
Those who are in the WhatsApp group.
Speaking of the signal group, there is indeed the attack against the Houthis, which also aims to free up commercial transit in this region. So here we can clearly see that.
For Europeans?
Even if it angers them.
No, but that's a bad argument, because the Houthis have never attacked European ships. They have attacked Israeli ships. So it's a bad excuse. No, the bombings against the Houthis correspond, in my opinion, to a brutal, probably criminal message addressed to Iran, the Houthis being obviously allies of Iran, and then probably also to a request, to an Israeli request.
But they were still talking about freeing up trade, which was hindered by
that's an excuse. It's a bad excuse, because the trade wasn't being hindered. And then the Houthis said the Houthis have a very clear position. They said we will prevent the transit of Israeli ships or Israeli cargoes heading to the port of Eilat. Besides, trade to the port of Eilat has practically dropped to zero, since then. And all this, as long as there is no ceasefire in Gaza. But from the moment there was a ceasefire, because we had a ceasefire for 6 weeks to 2 months, they perfectly respected that truce. And they threatened to resume their attacks, and they have resumed them partially from the moment the ceasefire was broken, when Netanyahu resumed his bombings on Gaza. So it's perfectly predictable. I mean, if we want the Houthis to stop bombing, well, there needs to be a ceasefire.
So perhaps returning to Ukraine, Putin reminded that the United Nations had already experienced the introduction of external governance, for example, in East Timor in 1999, and in certain parts of the former Yugoslavia, in New Guinea. He suggested following a similar path in Ukraine. Do you think that's realistic, that it's a good idea?
I was very familiar with Timor-Leste because I was the ambassador of Switzerland and responsible for Timor. Indeed, I witnessed a massive operation. Well, there were more than 10,000 United Nations representatives who gave birth to a new state and who, at the beginning, indeed, they practically organized within the United Nations itself all the machinery of the state and then handed it over. So frankly, I think Putin's idea is politically, it's a failure. I mean, it's an idea like that.
But is it feasible?
Feasible, no. I don't see how the UN could be tasked in the current United Nations context. We speak very little of the UN right now, but I think Putin, it's a certain cleverness on his part to bring the UN back into play. But Putin is a formidable player. And I think it should be interpreted like that. I think that Putin himself does not believe that the United Nations will ever take control of Ukraine, at least initially, to organize a new state. What he wants is to get rid of Zelensky. That I think everyone has understood, as well as those around him. So I would say that all ideas are good in this context.
What will happen to Zelensky then in this context?
Oh, well, he'll go to one of his villas, I think, that he has in Florida or elsewhere. I think that there is no problem for him.
I lost a bet because I had bet at the beginning of 2024. In January of this year, he would be in exile in England. I was 6 months ahead, maybe.
Yes, and then finally, I bet too, and I lost. I thought he was going to be removed in Kyiv itself by the Ukrainian forces that supported him from the start, but who perhaps now see that he no longer serves their interests necessarily. I think if I were Zelensky, I would be worried indeed.
Technically, the United Nations is capable of organizing elections, obviously relying on the Ukrainian administration. And that's perhaps where I see a problem, is that for it to work, there needs to be an alignment, there needs to be approval, support of Ukrainians. So a majority of the Ukrainian population and Ukrainian institutions, because the UN cannot replace the existing Ukrainian administration. And that's where I see the problem. But now what is happening? Because it is quite possible if all of a sudden the Russians and the Americans pass a resolution in the Security Council under Chapter 7 by saying, here, we mandate the Secretary General to organize elections in Ukraine. Will the French or the English veto it?
No, as in during the last resolution, they were strongly advised by the United States not to use their veto.
What resolution you say?
But it was about Ukraine. The terms, do you remember the exact terms? But we declare either a responsibility.
No, but it was a very short resolution. I think it was a paragraph that said, Considering the immense human suffering and loss of life that have occurred in the conflict in Ukraine, the Security Council is committed to peace, roughly speaking, to a ceasefire.
And without mentioning who was responsible, without repeating the usual narrative, and the Europeans were completely opposed. They were against it, but they did not use their star. They abstained.
They abstained.
So but your idea is absolutely incredible. It's true. In the current context, we could not exclude it at all. Trump and Putin are going to talk again. I wanted to ask you the question, by the way, in this strategic vision, and I find it fascinating, the maritime routes, etc. This friendship, in quotes, let's call it that, between Putin, it's still a relationship. I remember the conference during his first term, they're meeting in Helsinki, and when he came out of the meeting with Putin, there were only the translators, the interpreters, and who says, I understood everything. I now know that it was the FBI who did this, who did that. Putin explained it to me. Finally, it amazes me, so there is still a special bond between these two men. I do not know if it is a bromance, I do not know what it really is, but that plays a role. Because he did not say to himself, I have a strategic vision, I will try to separate Russia from China, I will set all this up. I think this friendship almost formed in mind. He wanted to reconnect with Putin, I think later, for Trump during his second term. It was very important, and then obviously afterward it creates a new synergy, a new dynamic. All this happened afterward, and it makes things much easier, the fact that the two men can talk to each other and that they do talk to each other.
Yes, well then, I don't know if it's friendship or if it's, no, it's certainly not friendship. It's more like a kind of alliance of circumstances. Maybe more than that still. I think that on a human level. In any case, what is certain is that there is a lot of respect. Trump respects strong people. I even tend to say strong men.
Even the leader of North Korea, let us remember, he met in Singapore during his first term.
So our records say Trump is somewhat a Russian agent for this. There's this whole theory, certainly somewhat conspiratorial as well, in this case on the other side, regarding his links with the KGB, etc. A fantasy.
Yeah, we'll never know. But honestly, I can't imagine Trump as an agent of the FSB or the KGB. It seems to me incredible.
In any case, there is no evidence to demonstrate.
No, we also talked about films, videos that would exist, that were taken in hotel rooms in Moscow.
With everything we already know about Trump, what could still affect him? He broadcasts videos. I don't think that it would make the second one move, as Chirac used to say.
So obviously it also raises the question of the European Union in this context, since there is clearly a declared support in any case from Western European countries towards Ukraine, a desire to continue arming Ukraine, willingness to send ground troops, probably or possibly. What do you think of this European position?
They have a very clear stance towards him. It is no longer my European Union. Honestly, since the European Union has been taken over by Madame Ursula von der Leyen, who made it a sort of war machine, all these visits, sitting on leopards, it is more than war frenzy with her, as I feel it. It is truly somewhat like Ms. Baerbock, the former or still German foreign minister. I find this taste shown, demonstrated at that level for the war and all that, frankly. Personally, I don't know what you think, Jean-Daniel, but I was very disappointed because ultimately Europe could have avoided this war. Trump is not wrong when he says it was a war that could have been avoided. That I remember very well when Messrs. Franz-Walter Steinmeier and Laurent Fabius were in Yanukovych's office. I wasn't in Kiev, maybe you were, and that they were pressuring the Ukrainians to sever economic ties with Russia, to ally with the European Union, and at the same time, at Maidan Square, we know it was the famous coup of 2014, I think there, the Europeans played a very, very bad role. Furthermore, they still had the mission, the mandate to be somewhat the sponsors, not just somewhat, of Minsk II, to supervise the agreements, yes, and then to push. I remember that our president, also president of the OSCE, Mr. Burkhalter, when he was returning from his visits to Kiev, where he was trying to convince Mr. Poroshenko that it was finally necessary to start negotiating with the separatists in Donbass. Poroshenko doubled the bombardments, nothing was done. Then, obviously, we learned from Ms. Merkel and Mr. Hollande, once the two were retired, that the Europeans not only did nothing, but that it was ultimately to allow the Ukrainian army to rearm. No, I think the European Union played a very poor role in all this. And since the war started, at first it was shock, and then very quickly it became a kind of enthusiasm for this war. Now that Europe has the possibility to glimpse peace, thanks to Trump, still it is the one that becomes completely, frenetically, hysterically in favor of the war. Not a week goes by without Mr. Starmer and Mr. Macron organizing conferences on coordination to organize reassurance troops, etc. While the Russians say they don't want NATO troops, nor from France, nor from England, these two countries insist on being involved if troops are sent. I am very, I don't know, Jean-Daniel, maybe you see the European Union in a somewhat positive light in this context, but it has disappointed me greatly, greatly disappointed me.
So, before talking about the European Union, there is something else I would like to say about Trump, if we can lend some bad intentions towards Trump or some kind of hidden Russian influences on Trump. It's also because what we see is that Trump is ultimately ready to accept that Putin fulfills all his objectives in Ukraine so that Putin can really declare victory. That's what makes people say, but why does Trump react like that? In my opinion, it's because first, he has other topics to discuss with Putin, and then he really wants the United States to disengage from this European conflict, the European reaction to that. They found themselves orphaned. It's a bit like when you fight in the playground, knowing there's always the big brother behind you who can come help if needed. Suddenly there's no big brother because he changed schools, and then you still have the same enemies in front of you. That's a scary feeling. In my opinion, that results from an extremely poor analysis of the situation, and that's something I don't understand because all these countries have extremely sophisticated intelligence and analysis services, and that these people did not understand that first, this war was not winnable. That too, we were not going to be able to bring the Russian economy to its knees as we were promised when the sanctions were imposed in 2022. Even I, who do not have 1/100th of the information these people have at their disposal, who do not have 1/100th of the intellectual capacity, of course, I was very furious. In March, April 2022, when the West pulled the plug on a ceasefire that was possible at that time, because I saw the scenario in my head, say Europe is not going to come out victorious, it's not possible, and now it's being put in place. What many had thought at the time was that it was in Europe's interest, not just Ukraine's, obviously, but in Europe's interest to have a ceasefire quickly. That didn't happen. And now we find ourselves alone. But
We're talking about Europe and the member countries.
Yes.
And you put them all in the same basket,
yes, Europe represents its member countries.
But they do not work together. Madame von der Leyen, there is Macron, there is Tomaine. Each gives the impression of headless chickens.
Meloni does not entirely agree with sending ground troops. She is more subtle.
But I would still like to say something positive about the European Union.
Oh, really?
Yes. Well, obviously, they are trying to react and give themselves a role in this post-war, to try to tug on dad's sleeve, then say, hey, we're here too. So what they're trying to do is say, well, there you go, we're going to send troops.
but as part of a peace agreement or a ceasefire agreement, right? I don't believe that anyone is foolish enough to intend to send troops to fight the Russians, so that's not the intent. And then the second thing they did, now the Russians don't want it, we'll see. Now the second thing they did that seems could also be a good thing to increase defense budgets. So you might say, but increasing defense budgets means fueling war. Not necessarily. It's also it can also be a good consideration in the sense that it anticipates a sudden or gradual American withdrawal from European affairs. So it means that we have finally realized that we cannot rely on the Americans to defend ourselves.
Finally, I would say. Finally.
Yes, finally. And I mean, in 2017, Macron was already talking about strategic autonomy. He might be the only one who saw things clearly early enough, but no one was ready to follow him, neither the English nor the Germans.
Not even him. The problem with Macron is that he often saw very clearly, but he did nothing afterwards. That is also his problem.
Well, because he wanted to Europeanize, because France on its own doesn't really have the means. That's mostly what I thought. But now it's changed. Merz, on the evening of the election, even before the result was known, said, we must gain our independence from the United States. And I quite believe in the realist theory of international relations, which is that peace results from a balance of power, including armed forces. So if Europe finally creates a credible military capability, I think that it could be rather favorable to stability on the continent. Now, personally, I would also like to hear European leaders not only talk about how to rearm, but also how to disarm. During the war, even during the Cold War and right after the Cold War, we had agreements on nuclear disarmament, but also conventional in Europe. All these agreements have become obsolete, and now it is time. And by the way, our Swiss president of the OSCE should commit
I'd be surprised if he did it.
I don't know. But it would be important to say, on one hand, we are investing 800 billion, but we are also making an offer to Russia to resume negotiations on limitations of conventional offensive arms in Europe, like tanks, artillery, planes. That would seem to me to be a good policy.
Absolutely. I would say, I completely agree with you. Europe must regain its deterrent capability, that's certain. However, where I would have a slight reservation with what you said is that this decision to rearm, it indicates a sort of panic. Everyone is throwing in their billions. What I also really regretted is that Merz declared in the German parliament exactly what Macron declared. By the way, they met the day before. Maybe that's why. Both said that Russia represented an existential threat to Germany, existential to France. It is not like that we start to talk again about what you just said in the second point. And there, I completely agree with you. Europe needs to rearm. There is no shadow of a doubt, but it is not necessary to do it in 6 months. Besides, they are not going to do it in 6 months. France has no money. Germany, Merz, has completely lost all credibility because he broke all his election promises to not increase the debt by removing the debt brake ceiling, thanks to the Greens, whom he detests. It gives the impression of a return to a kind of Weimar Republic in Germany. And the Germans are very worried. And my first reaction was to say, very well, the Germans are going to spend 1 billion or 1,000 billion euros to rearm themselves. Well, every time Germany rearmed, it went badly. Finished? Well, that's a slightly negative remark. But what I want to say again, Jean-Daniel, I agree with you. We must rearm, that's for sure, but we shouldn't talk about it too much. We should do it. However, where we should talk, and where they are absolutely silent, is about the aftermath, the post-war in Ukraine. We will need to rebuild a collective security organization on this continent without the Americans or with very little of America. So it will be necessary to restart dialogue with Moscow, with Russia, and it is urgent to send signals. First, that Putin is no longer untouchable since Trump are acceptable, but the Europeans are very far. The Europeans have somewhat come to a sort of Biden's America. You know, they have taken up all the themes However, Europe must send signals clearly indicating that it wants new agreements for arms control, because it is going to spend billions now, but there is no agreement. So everyone will go in all directions. And also, above all, there is a desire to return to the table, as we did after all, when it resulted in the Helsinki Accords of 1975 with the USSR. So what was achieved with the USSR is probably even easier to do with Russia.
Can we not also see here a big success of the European military-industrial complex with, for example, the action of Rheinmetall, which took 100%?
So that for me is, I wanted precisely to talk about that. I was on a discussion panel last week with a former Belgian defense minister, really brilliant. He said, but it's all well and good to allocate billions, but we need to know how we're going to spend them. And that's what I also say regarding Switzerland. Our army received 30 billion to spend over 4 years. But where is the concept? Where is the security policy? What is the strategic concept? And in the absence, a strategically developed concept then, rather finely, right, that defines the priorities, including priorities in the acquisition of armament. The big risk is that this money will be seized by the major European arms companies. So ultimately, these are disguised subsidies to Airbus, Rheinmetall, Leonardo, and Thales.
And at Volkswagen, since, I'll come back to it, Volkswagen is going to start producing tanks.
That's right, exactly. And that is foolishness. That is really extremely poorly spent money. What I humbly advise our European friends, I did it on this Belgian television platform last week. I should have listened. We had a bit of the same problem in the 19th century, you know. We had 22 armies. As we had a civil war, we had our problems. How did we manage to unify the Swiss army? We first established a military school in Thun, and we created a general staff. So let's create a European military academy to train officers. And that would be the embryo of what could become a European army and then a European general staff. And it would be up to them to set the priorities in terms of defense, acquisition, and investment.
Yes, but they are putting the cart before the horse, as you say. They decide to spend as if spending, or even the announcement itself, because in the end, they haven't spent yet, could replace the absence of a European army. There are 27 armies. In the end, Madame von der Leyen said that it was necessary to collectivize and mutualize the arms orders, but all that does not yet make an army. That's the problem.
I think one of the problems that many of our European leaders have is that they leave communication to the communicators, if I can put it that way. But the communicators have taken on far too much importance. I mean, when they wave the existential threat posed by Russia like that, as the same communication logic saying, if we want the people to accept that we spend these billions on armament, we must make them very, 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 very scared. So they brandish the existential threat of Russia. It's just that it's not credible. It doesn't work. But in my opinion, it's something that was found by the communications specialists who proliferate far too much around our political leaders, including in Switzerland.
Who have faded away, and it's even dangerous. It's dangerous if we follow the German press. Not a single day goes by without new statements or new communications from intelligence services, from the Minister of Defense. And if we combine them all, Russia is going to attack Germany by the year 2030. So it is no longer a question of if, but when. And all this creates, on one hand, yes, it facilitates majorities to purchase armaments and to launch of rearmaments in general, but also it creates an extremely dangerous situation. So much so that Sigmar Gabriel, the former German vice-chancellor, on a TV set in Germany, said, but stop telling us that Russia has a window of opportunity to attack us in the next 5 or 6 years.
That seems particularly crazy.
But it's delusional. Now he said to us, but Putin will attack us in 2028 and then you won't be ready. It's true, there's a completely absurd side to this inflation of alarmist talk, but they come from the Elysee, they come from the Chancellery in Germany, and that's what worries me enormously.
And above all,
We talk about the European arms industry, but in reality it doesn't truly exist. The real arms industries are in Russia, the United States and China. So ultimately, developing European weaponry means purchasing a large part of the equipment and weapons from these countries. Therefore, sovereignty would not exist in that context.
There are still things to develop in Europe, but it will take time.
65% of European defense spending today, goes to American manufacturers, which is huge. That means there is still 35%. Now, that doesn't mean there is not a know-how, a capability that is there and that we can develop.
And it seems that the Swiss arms industry has been sidelined by the main NATO countries. In any case, it is complaining.
It seems that RUAG has some problems
yes,
too, huh?
But not only that. Even other companies, Demovag, well, all those which usually had quite a few European clients, this time they said no, because, well, we don't want to take the risk that we can't use your weapons.
I wonder if we couldn't have done things a little
in
differently.
Switzerland?
Yeah, I mean, if we couldn't have already hitched onto the European defense industry wagon, but also by putting a little money into the common pot.
We question the neutrality, so we talk about it.
Yes, but there is this non-re-exportation clause, etc., which has created many problems.
But that's not in the Constitution. It's not even in the AE Convention. It's our law.
We can change. It's our law, nah? Exactly. That's what I meant. God knows, we are going to talk about it, I imagine, about neutrality. God knows if I am a supporter of neutrality, but I find that this law is unnecessary and that it is unnecessarily, penalizing for our arms industry. That's certain.
So, before returning to Switzerland, I wanted to finish with Trump, especially on the subject of USAID.
We cannot end with Trump.
Let's continue a bit more. On the subject of USAID, from which he cut a good part of the resources. So is it a tragedy for the NGOs or the end of a certain American hegemony in the world?
No, well, I think there are two aspects, right? USAID was not just about supporting media and then NGOs promoting American values, democracy, then trying to, let's say, transform American soft power, sometimes into revolution. No. While there was a part of that, yes, but the bulk of the money invested by USAID was still in programs related to health, education, and the fight against AIDS, for example. So programs that had an impact on people's everyday lives. So I think it's an exaggeration to say there he did well. No, I think there are many human dramas unfolding because USAID practically cut off funding overnight to organizations that were doing an excellent job. I know someone there who runs an organization that takes care of orphans in Colombia. They had a big company. They had 300 people, and they had to lay off 100 people almost overnight. So that really has a big impact, but on humanitarian issues. And then it also limits the goodwill, the positive image that the United States can have because of these humanitarian actions.
Yes, from a selfish American point of view, one might wonder if it is not against American interests. On the other hand, I have a bit of a different opinion than that of Jean-Daniel. Now, I find that I was very surprised to see, it's like when you create a smoke screen, a basement, and you see the rats coming out. I was very surprised to see certain rats. I thought to myself, it's not true. Did you get money from your side? Did you get American money? Did you get dollars? Yes, dollars, newspapers, organizations. So fewer humanitarian NGOs, of course, that I share with you the concern that some people will suffer because of this. But on the other hand, there are quite a few organizations that have benefited from American aid and which, well, it surprised me. It simply surprised me. And we realized today, and it's interesting, we were talking about the European Union. We see that the European Union has somewhat the same methods as USAID. The European Union spends millions to influence opinions, public opinion. So here, I have some questions. USAID has not influenced public opinion in the world in general and in our democracies. And the European Union also should not do it. And I believe that millions of dollars and euros have been used for that. So, within the European Union, we should also tidy up a bit and clean the audience tables, because I think there are adjustments that need to be made.
Somehow that can bring us back to Romania, you know.
or in all the countries where Russians are accused of trying to exert their influence to sway, making it seem that the election is leaning one way or the other. But there are indeed some countries that are subject to these tensions, these struggles of influence. And then there is Russian propaganda, there is Western propaganda, but it is also propaganda in a way. That's not called propaganda, that's called programs to support democracy and free media.
Yes, and then at the level of the European Union as well. It was. We funded NGOs in our countries, not Switzerland, but in the countries of the European Union, to influence their governments in the direction the Commission wanted. So here, there is a little. It's completely incestuous and completely politically, in my opinion, unacceptable and...
You know that some soft power policies also went through the humanitarian NGOs.
Yes, of course. We must not be naive, Jean-Daniel. I completely agree with you. We must not be naive. We must not say, we need to eliminate all that, because naturally, I read somewhere, you rightly said, if we disappear from that area, it will be an invitation to others like Russia or China, because they certainly will not hesitate either. It's obvious. But what bothers me the most is when we use the millions of Europeans to influence public opinion in the countries of these Europeans. Afterwards, if we use some money to promote democracy, if at least we do it, why not in Africa or elsewhere in the world? I have seen as well, I have seen European money extremely well used for good governance, for all that, and that is not open to criticism.
Good governance, I'm a bit skeptical about it, but I find there are neo-colonialist undertones.
If it is really good.
Yes, but there are some neo-colonialist undertones in good governance, because it's a bit like we're going to explain to these people who are sort of backward how they should manage their affairs.
Jean-Daniel, I was an ambassador in Africa, and my way of helping the African countries where I was, in Kenya, but also the surrounding countries, was precisely to have contacts with civil society and to tell them everything they should no longer accept from their corrupt leaders and their corrupt system. That is also part of good governance.
It's just that I feel like we slap on them certain principles and certain ideals.
They are quite intelligent.
Yes, exactly.
They are very intelligent.
They are intelligent enough to develop their own system of governance, which should not have to model after ours. Besides, ours, I sometimes feel that we are not critical enough of our own system of governance, and that sometimes we almost also need to have some African NGOs that come to explain to us how we should manage our affairs.
One must sweep in front of one's own door.
I think so too. We might talk about the DDPs later, but if there's an example that is quite striking, it's definitely that one.
To end aid to Africa, I am convinced that the billions and billions we have spent since the independence of all these countries have kept them in underdevelopment. I was giving an interview recently again, and I know there are Africans who work a lot on these themes, on these topics, and who think the same way. In the end, we have not helped these countries. We have alleviated our guilty conscience, but we have not helped them. However, what I think is that we should be available to them when needed, if they really ask us for support. That's what I meant, but not to impose anything.
I see we who are going to theorize about good governance, and then on the other hand, I see the Chinese building highways, railways, and ports.
It's more useful than good governance.
I still feel like it contributes more to development, economic, social, from the global south. They have it like that, rather than explaining to them how they should fill out this or that
I
form.
withdraw the term so that we can move on to something else.
No, but it's a really important subject.
There still is an agenda behind Chinese aid, though.
Of course.
Yes, it's about bringing resources from the countries where they have invested to China, whether it's agriculture, uranium and others like that.
And then to gain influence. But everyone wants to try to gain influence. So if it serves these African countries, especially, why not? But it's true that the question is essential. I have seen Africans leasing hectares and thousands of hectares to produce rice or produce things that only the Chinese buy. And there are many problems that are related to aid in international cooperation. Let's say it like that. Speaking of international cooperation, perhaps we can go back to Switzerland. Now, there are indeed several hot topics on the table. Notably, there are the bilateral agreements with the conclusion of an agreement in the year 2024. Do you already think on this point that it is a path to joining the European Union?
The bilaterals?
Well, for me, I don't see it as it could. Why not? There are certainly some who think it would be a step towards membership. However, I think when people say that the Swiss are quite doubtful about it, I find that they want to think it over. I believe they are absolutely right, because we are trying to sell them a project by saying, but it's exactly what we did in the past. We put a few pieces in the Lego, a few pieces in the puzzle, but it changes absolutely nothing. No, it does change the dynamic of our relations with the European Union. So we talk about automatic adoption or dynamic adoption. Dynamic adoption is the word we found to remove the word automatic that is not liked, etc. But in any case, there is an adoption of European law that will evolve afterward. Whether we like it or not, we will always be able to make a referendum against. But finally, with the risk of everything collapsing, no. We're changing the nature of our relations with the European Union. And that, I think, the Swiss somehow realize. And it truly deserves reflection. Also in relation to what the European Union is today. And I personally was in favor of Switzerland's accession in the 1990s, at the time of the vote on the economic area. If the European Union had become a super Switzerland, I would have been in favor. I would have frankly signed for the disappearance of Switzerland into a greater European Switzerland. The United States of Europe that would have functioned like Switzerland. But we are far from that. Why? Because the European Union at the beginning was criticized as being an administrative machine created by French, but used by Germans, with the Gründlichkeit. The French, when they have a huge machine, it's okay because it's in the French way. But the Germans, it's something else. And I believe that the European Union, since the euro, what has it done since the euro to unify, to becoming a federative state? A federal state? Nothing. So it has become a huge apparatus that creates standards, that creates resolutions. And I think there is a significant lack of democracy. There is a lack of democracy in all that. And somewhere, yeah, it scares me. It worries me.
I would simply say that we must have good relations with our neighbors, who are also our primary outlets for
Economically,
our goods.
we must
Economically, we have no choice. For me, the essential question is that we cannot afford to make it so that our companies, and I am especially thinking of SMEs, our SMEs are not on an equal footing in the competition that is becoming increasingly tough with our neighbors. So it's there, it's on that basis, if you will, that I will judge these agreements. I understood that now the Swiss unions are happy, so which means that there might only be the UDC that would oppose these agreements.
We'll see. They take a lot of time to translate it. They are still translating. We haven't seen any text yet.
They should arrive this summer.
They should arrive this summer.
Yes, but in the meantime, apparently there have been conversations that have made good progress between the Swiss economy and the unions.
But you said there's only the UDC. I read today that Mr. Cassis criticizes his party, apparently in rather understandable terms, the lack of support from the FDP. I mean, there are quite a few people who are questioning this. I think that if I had to bet today, I wouldn't bet on the success of all this, especially since the European Union told us, listen, but don't do the salami slice tactic. We understood. You will present 4 votes. No, it is a single package. This creates new political problems. Yes, so the industries absolutely need to find the best way for them to continue trading and developing with the European Union.
And it's especially the small and medium-sized enterprises, because, well, note that the large companies, the multinationals, if they have the impression that Switzerland is no longer a favorable seat for their activities, they will relocate, which would also be a big loss for Switzerland. So multinational companies need to be satisfied as well. But the issue arises differently for them.
We have more and more business leaders who are, yes, quite skeptical. Mr. Hayek, You know, recently, Mr. Hayek said that, well, we should be careful before clinging to a monster like the European Union.
And the question is also the neutrality of Switzerland, though. This is a topic that is dear to both of you, perhaps with slightly different views, but how do you envision this neutrality, especially since 2022?
That's less the European Union. It's more
For
Europe.
me, the European Union is not really a problem. Certainly not the agreements that have just been initialed.
Number. Come on, take the first shot. Not about neutrality, but...
Well, I think that Swiss neutrality has greatly eroded. The perception of Swiss neutrality has greatly eroded over the past 3 years. First, because we could not explain the spectacular turnaround made over a weekend regarding sanctions against Russia. And then secondly, because in the Middle East, regarding Israel, unfortunately, we were in the Security Council, which forced us to take a position on subjects where otherwise we wouldn't have had to take a position. And practically every time we took a position that was, let's say, more or less dictated by American-Israeli interests. So this too, I think we lost a lot of credibility. So neutrality lost a lot of credibility in the world. And all this is the result of leadership, which was weak. It must be said, I believe it was weak, without a clear compass, without a clear principle of where we wanted to go, what we wanted to do. So yes, I think neutrality is part of the safety net or of Switzerland. Both we benefited a lot from in our professional life, and now I think we have more or less the same formula. We become, or maybe we already are, a Luxembourg with some Alps. Now, is it recoverable? That we'll perhaps discuss in the second part of the topic.
Yes, I would go even further. I think I was going to say among the countries that matter. Well, we don't have the right to say such a thing, but I mean among the European countries, Russia, United States, we are no longer considered neutral. Besides, Russia clearly put us on the list of unfriendly states.
Are the negotiations taking place in Riyadh?
Yes, that's obvious, for all sorts of reasons. Although Mr. Cassis tried to say that Riyadh was the continuation of the Bergenstock, but he said it once. He didn't repeat himself because he saw the reactions. And the United States too. Biden, in the first State of the Union address after the start of the war in Ukraine, said, look at Switzerland. Even Switzerland is no longer neutral. No, we are no longer neutral. So there you go. That's from the perspective. Among those states, we're still neutral. Maybe in Africa, in Asia. They're waiting. They're waiting for the BRICS. They're waiting for their final diagnosis. But I think, Jean-Daniel, what do you think? You pointed out that neutrality, it's true, is in a very bad position. What do you think of the attacks inside? Neutrality, one could say our authorities were a bit incompetent. They were really incompetent. They didn't communicate. They didn't manage to. I actually think that, unlike you, the reimposition of sanctions after that famous weekend was a blatant violation of neutrality. Because ultimately, we joined in an economic fight aimed at bringing the Russian economy to its knees. So, one of the belligerents, we bring its economy to its knees. So inevitably, we affect its belligerent capabilities. Now, we did it, and that already violated neutrality. But what do you think of this? I see the situation as quite concerning. Ultimately, it's not that our authorities mishandled defending neutrality. I believe that neutrality is no longer defended among the political and media elites in Switzerland, and worse, it is even being attacked from within.
So,
I have the feeling I am one of those country bumpkins. Recently, a general communicated this to some of my friends. Those bumpkins who still defend neutrality, the fetishists of neutrality. So, it is attacked by the elites inside, military, diplomats, who also want to sit at the table with NATO members. Our generals would love, actually love, they go there, they love being with multi-starred American generals who were in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. So they come back from those exercises in Ramstein with stars in their eyes. So my question is, don't you think that the real danger concerning neutrality is not so much from outside, but from within the country?
It's a bit on both sides, please, because it is understood that these anti-neutrality groups have, since 2022 in any case, been gaining ground. In Switzerland, well, we made the decisions we made. And then, as a result, our neutrality, the perception of our neutrality has been elevated in the Islamic world. You know, following the bankruptcy of the mandate, the failure, Switzerland received a mandate from the United Nations General Assembly to organize a conference on the respect for the Geneva Conventions in Palestine. And then, well, they declared failure. We failed for the first time to fulfill a mandate of the General Assembly, even as we were leaving the Security Council, and are very proud of everything we accomplished in the Security Council in terms of international humanitarian law. So it is not only in Europe, in the United States, in Russia, but it is also a little further in the vast world. We have lost a lot of credibility for our neutrality. Now, since Trump, the NATO fetishists,
they took a hit.
They are a little bit suspended in the void. You know, they have to wait. They have to find. I don't know. I don't know how they will do it. Will they latch on
to the European army?
To a European army that does not exist. Hoping that after Trump, NATO will become what NATO has always been. But what is not said enough to all these brave generals who, like you say it very well, Love, are fascinated to see someone who was in Iraq, just like others were fascinated to meet someone who had been in Vietnam in our youth. But it would still be necessary from time to time to tell all these generals and all these NATO fetishists, I think the term applies perfectly, because in addition to being fetishists, the uniforms, the medals, the guns, all that, it's really about fetishism. We should still ask them, when was the last time the Americans or NATO won a war? We should still, I think we should occasionally remind the Swiss population that in wanting to move closer to NATO, we are aligning with an alliance that certainly has been useful in maintaining peace in Europe. And yet, they have neither succeeded in avoiding the war in Ukraine nor the war in former Yugoslavia. But more importantly, they have lost all the others. We want to ally ourselves with losers. NATO are losers. Iraq, Afghanistan, shameful. Libya, shameful. So sometimes we win wars, we give the impression of winning wars because we destroy a lot of things. But we are incapable of rebuilding afterward, and especially of establishing systems of governance, governments, regimes, of recreating a social and political fabric that matches to the objectives we had set, that is to bring democracy to Iraq through force, as Chirac had said, claiming it wouldn't work. Well, it didn't work. So do we realize that we are fascinated by all this military power, but a military power that does not have a strategy, which just does not have a strategist to know how to wisely use this firepower? Well, it is a military power that hardly produces anything other than deaths, destruction, and hatred against the one who employs it.
But yes, wars in history have often served to rebuild a new balance after those wars. But as Bertrand Badi says, since 45, there have been 500 wars. He counted, I think, that's roughly the number, but none of these wars have served any purpose other than to empty arsenals. Nothing positive was built afterward. They served no purpose. And among these 500 wars, a certain number are American wars and NATO wars.
One can wonder if a war is only for that in the end, right?
To empty the arsenals, yes, today, that's all it's
for. So I would still like to, I was a bit extreme. I will still say that there are two exceptions where the Americans or NATO won wars. The first is Grenada, I think we shouldn't forget Ronald Reagan's invasion of Grenada in 1983.
I remember it very well. I was in New York.
Which was a big success. There was Panama too, which was more of a police operation. But there was the Kosovo War, and the Kosovo War served a purpose other than emptying arsenals. It really allowed Kosovo to detach from
illegally
Serbia.
From the perspective of international law.
I believe that at the time the head of our legal division at the DFAE had produced a legal opinion stating that it wasn't so illegal.
Yes, but they make them reproduce anything, these leaders of public international law. I will tell you that the leader of public international law, in 2 weeks, he produced a legal opinion saying that we could not recognize the state of Palestine. And as he misunderstood the instructions from our leader at the time, 2 weeks later, he produced a legal opinion saying that we could very well recognize the state of Palestine. No, Kosovo. So if you consider Kosovo as legal, then do me a favor and consider Crimea as legal too.
My reasoning is more twisted. There is something called a Convention on Genocide or on the Prevention of Genocide.
But there is no genocide.
Which obliges all states to use all means to prevent the commission of a genocide. Yet, a few years before the Kosovo War, so before the rise of hostilities between the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was guerrilla supported by the Westerners, and the Serbian army, there was in Srebrenica a true genocide recognized as such by the courts, by international justice, where Serbian forces had killed 8,000 men and boys, Bosnians, in 1 week. One could have one can build an argument saying there was a plausible risk of committing a genocide in Kosovo. There were examples of quite serious abuses, you know. That I experienced it closely enough to know that there is a part of the intellectual elite, the elite of medias, that was targeted by the Serbs. There were paramilitary groups, somewhat like in Bosnia, that were in the cities. So there was a real atmosphere that could have led to a genocide and thus legitimized the NATO strikes. I know it's a stretch. It's not completely absurd.
Because in my opinion, there are more of those people in the Donbass than among the populations, Russian-speaking Ukrainians. We can expand too.
And especially once Kosovo was made autonomous, there were abuses against the Serbian populations as well on the territory until 2005.
On which we were prevented from investigating at the time when I worked at the Hague Tribunal. With Carla Del Ponte, and thanks to the book by Carla Del Ponte, there was a report by Dick Marty, two prosecutors from Ticino, who are my heroes, the heroes of international justice. Frankly, we should be proud to have had these two figures in Switzerland's history, because Dick Marty also investigated the CIA's secret prisons during the time of Guantanamo and the Iraq War, you know. Hats off to Mr. Dick Marty. And following Dick Marty's report, well, there were a few more episodes, but today, 22 years later, when these people could have been tried 22 years ago today, finally, these people are on trial in The Hague. In The Hague in a specially designed court to judge them. So imagine the cost we could have spared if the Westerners had let us investigate these crimes back when they were committed. That is to say, well, the late 1990s, early 2000s. I will always remember once I had invited, rather the head of the Balkan sector at the Foreign Office in London. They call it the Eastern Adriatic Department. We were talking about naval power earlier. So they see the world from the sea, hence Eastern Adriatic Department, so which covered Serbia and Kosovo, came to see me, and then they knew we were investigating one of the leaders of Kosovo, the Kosovo Liberation Army, who was Prime Minister of Kosovo at the time, Ramush Haradinaj. And then she put her hand on my arm like this and said,
"Well, you know, Jean-Daniel, we have nothing against you indicting Haradinaj, but it should be a robust indictment, and without our support and the American support, we really don't see how you could produce a robust indictment. And we talk to the Americans, we know they are not giving you anything either." Father Fidel beyond cynicism in all its splendor.
So to translate?
Translate very well. That's what I was going to ask.
No, yeah, they did not want you to do anything.
Yes, and
They were not ready to give you the elements.
They straight up told us, we will give you nothing, right? And if we give you nothing, you won't succeed in making a solid indictment against Haradinaj. It doesn't mean he's guilty or not. We don't care. That's not the point. The point is we won't allow you to indict him. And then 20 years later, they are still on trial, and hats off to them. And that's the European Union, right? It's thanks to the European Union that these trials are taking place now. So I would say sometimes there are still acts of justice, and we have a Swiss judge who is at this tribunal, an absolutely remarkable figure.
And so, to make the connection perhaps with the Middle East, I have another question about Switzerland, about the influence of the lobby or the Israelis, in any case, within the Swiss governmental and parliamentary bodies, particularly in the field of defense, but perhaps not only that. When you are within the structures, did you witness this influence?
We need to give Jean-Daniel an hour, on this
We
topic.
have already talked about it during our interview.
I can be very brief. As for foreign affairs, it's very simple. Cassis takes his orders from Jerusalem. As for the parliament,
The burial takes its patterns and orders in Jerusalem.
No to UN watch
It's,
and to the
more
Israeli
limited.
embassy. But there was a surge. Yeah? Remarkable of the Council of States on the continuation of Hafha, but still the signal was still positive, given that Switzerland is not the third country in the world after Sweden and the United States to cease its support on Arabia. So there is a bounce back, somewhat unexpected, I must say.
Especially since the surge came from the center. They are not used to having surges. The center...
Well, listen, there are quite brilliant people in the council.
People.
In the Council of States from the center, there are remarkable personalities, especially women, by the way, from Fribourg.
That's it.
No, but it's not just that. There was a very, very beautiful surge from civil society because there were many petition letters, pressure from civil society. And frankly, it's to the credit of the Council of States.
Honestly, it is really serious that we are at this point. When we talk about an extraordinary awakening, it should be obvious that we support an organization, which is, by the way, the only humanitarian one there, and is led by a Swiss. But, well...
you are absolutely
no,
right.
But...
and now it comes. As for defense, I think it's simpler. There are two elements, a cognitive bias, a bit like we said earlier, the fascination for people who have combat experience. Because our military dreams of that, obviously. And then it's not possible if we are doomed to live in the novel The Tartar Steppe, because we are the country,
that's why they are drawn to those who have fought.
Exactly, fascinated. So, I think there has been a cognitive bias everywhere for a very long time. At the Department of Defense, the Intelligence Service, in the Army, at Arma Suisse, Ruch, I'm not sure,
there is corruption
but the others, I'm sure. Which means we have a positive bias towards everything that comes from Israel. And then, in addition to this cognitive bias, there are the armament and intelligence lobbies. So the wolves and espionage that are well organized, that are quite powerful.
That is to say, concretely, can we be a bit more specific about these networks?
Listen, generally, when you make deals of 200 or 300 million, you have intermediaries, you have consulting firms that are involved in this kind of link and then take a cut in the process. And there are a few, in German-speaking Switzerland especially, who benefit well from drones that do not work, transmission systems that also do not work.
Do you have names?
No, I am not going to name names.
Georges, Martin, you also have, no, but in terms of maybe not names, but your experience of this influence.
I think the worst influence is the one that has already entered people's minds. It's like he said, cognitive bias. For example, it leads these people to choose an Israeli drone, which is completely ridiculous. Because you see, it freezes. It does not match the climate of Switzerland at all. We have to fly helicopters for etc. And then they also chose, I was told, a new radio system. So transmissions in the army are very important. And then we also chose Israeli, but there are no mountains there, so there's no problem. The waves travel. But as soon as there's a hill, a mountain, it doesn't go through. And that's it. So there you have it. It's also another example of these. So when the Israelis politically, militarily, got into the heads of our decision makers, whether in Parliament, the Federal Council, or elsewhere, everything becomes much simpler. And then throughout the chain, I can also emphasize there are lots of people lining their pockets, even if it's not possible to give names. I don't know them. Jean-Daniel probably knows them, some of them, but it exists. That's obvious.
So corruption, to be clear...
Yes, it's outright corruption.
No, that's not really corruption. There is real consultancy work. You know, in all these arms purchases...
He is being ironic.
No, in all these arms purchases, there are offset deals that are between 60 and 100%. I believe for the drones, it is 100%. That means Elbit must find or spend 300 million in Switzerland. How do they expect them to do that? They are in Israel. So what do? There are consultants who come, who help them to navigate, to make contacts, and then create a company in Switzerland, etc. So there is a whole business around that, which is very profitable. Money, and who have an interest in these financial flows. So these arms purchases obviously continue. We do not sell arms to Israel because of their human rights violations and the fact that they are in conflict and violate international rights. But that does not prevent very close cooperation between our two armies for the reasons we have discussed.
But this money still ends up, it's still corruption in a way. It ends up in the pockets of people who do nothing other than simply be there because they do.
No, but putting people on hold,
that is to say, if it were in Serbia, I think we would not hesitate to talk about corruption.
I would go further than you, Jean-Daniel. Indeed, I think that it is somehow, well, it is not healthy. When we receive millions simply because a Swiss company or personalities are needed to allow these offset operations, in a way, yes.
That's how it goes.
That is how it happens, for sure.
And in any case, it created certain affinities with the Israeli government that perhaps leads to a rather mild condemnation regarding what is happening in Gaza, for example, since October 7th. No, but that's something...
You know, the Federal Council is organized in an extremely departmentalized manner. So regarding international law, that's for the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Concerning armaments, that's for the Federal Department of Defense, Civil Protection, and Sports. There isn't much discussion between the two. I'll tell you a story that I hope will make you smile. When I was an ambassador in Israel, at one point, we learned, it was in the media, that Switzerland went to test the famous drones over the Golan, occupied Syrian territory. So, obviously, it stirred things up a bit, and then we received a press release from the Federal Department of Defense, Civil Protection and Sports, which said it can only be said with a Swiss-German accent, because otherwise it doesn't come across as well. So those who knew that the drones have been tested over the Golan, they didn't know that the Golan was an occupied territory. And those who knew that the Golan is an occupied territory didn't know that the drones were being tested. Obviously, I didn't know anything. I knew about the ban on going to the Golan on an official mission, of course.
Were you the ambassador in Israel at the time?
Yes, I was an ambassador, so we see that. I burst out laughing, of course. And then afterwards, they brought that out, and we burst out into laughter a second time. But they took measures after that. In this, they obliged the Swiss army to inform me every time they sent a delegation to Israel. And I assure you, there were a lot.
But yes, so Another story that I experienced personally, it's not quite related to Israel, but well, it's somewhat in the same vein. Do you remember crypto? You know, those machines with a back door, etc., that no one and everyone was unaware of, except those who organized it. And a few Swiss, you know, Mr. Villager, who was the chief of the army at the time, had been informed that there were Swiss machines being sold worldwide. They were sold because they were Swiss for encrypted message transmissions. And I was an ambassador in Indonesia, and I was often with the representative of crypto because I was, nonetheless, the official representative of Switzerland in the Indonesian ministries to give assurance with him, by my presence, that these were machines above all suspicion. These machines, when I learned that there were these holes in the back, I was personally furious, and we were on the brink of a mega scandal in Switzerland. Rundschau had conducted an entire investigation. Swiss-German television, they had come to interview me in Bern. Everything had been prepared. They started the first broadcasts, and then COVID arrived.
Saved by COVID?
Yes, because the federal parliament wanted to create a PEC, a Parliamentary Inquiry Commission. We were about to
Which
have
rarely
one.
happens in
Which
Switzerland.
rarely happens in Switzerland. And then COVID happened, everyone forgot, and there you go, and people whose names I know very well, and you too, Jean Daniel, one of them is with us now in the department. Those people, once again, the Teflon effect happened. Everything was forgotten.
Still no name then?
Well, but he was known since he was the head of intelligence at the time of crypto, and now he is the Secretary General of the Department of Foreign Affairs. So there you go, there's no secret, you know, but he was lucky because he too, when he was among those who knew but acted as if they didn't know. That's also the Swiss way of handling things like the Golan and the drones.
Yes. But anyway, I don't know if we're going to talk about corruption cases within the UDPS, but when we talk about this kind of indolence, of inertia, by saying we hide everything and then it will eventually disappear, well, we saw it very clearly in the Ruch corruption case. The guy managed to embezzle 10 million by selling spare parts and then pocketing the proceeds. How do you even manage to do that? I don't know, since all this should have been controlled. And then we discover this in 2019. And then it comes out in 2025.
And that there are resignations, etc.
I would say one should, I said to our former colleague in Geneva, who is the director of the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces. We have something like that, precisely to go learn in the vast world how it is necessary, how to manage the armed forces, and especially how to keep them under civilian and democratic control. And I told her, listen, my dear Nathalie Chouar, I said to her, Nathalie, it's in Bern where you are needed.
So you have been both Mr. Rohr, ambassador, and Mr. Martin, I believe, second in command at the Israeli embassy. So what do you concretely think about what is happening today in Gaza? So Netanyahu broke the ceasefire, 400 dead, following strikes on the 18th of March. There were large demonstrations in Israel, but there were also in the Gaza Strip that were repressed, you know,
against Hamas,
etc. Obviously, yes. How do you analyze this situation a bit now? We've indeed already talked about it in our respective interviews, but perhaps to go over recent developments a bit, especially Trump and his position.
You were the ambassador, I was the number 2.
Yes, I don't know where to start for me. The first thing that comes to mind is the population of Gaza. It's appalling. They have been stuck since 2006. 2007, between the anvil of Hamas and the Israeli hammer that strikes very hard. And it's horrible. It's horrible. More than a year ago, the International Court of Justice spoke of a plausible risk of genocide. The risk has risen, the plausibility of genocide has become even greater and even greater after the breaking of their ceasefire. Firstly, I don't see a military objective in the resumption of the bombings. Maybe there is one. What are they trying? Eradicate Hamas? Yes, fine. They have already tried for 15 months. So I don't see what is the military objective. On the other hand, the Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, in a speech last week, said, you people of Gaza, you must now eradicate Hamas, throw them out, otherwise you will suffer a lot, we will bomb you very, very, very hard, but if you throw them out, you will have an excellent life, a very beautiful life elsewhere. So that, in my opinion, is an indication or an incriminating element that could prove the genocidal intent of the Israelites.
It's no longer just an intention, it's political.
Yes, but no, but...
We are in the right, you are correct.
In legal terms. So in the definition of genocide, there are material facts, the elimination, the eradication of a population in whole or in part from a territory. And then the other element would be intent. So while they commit these acts, they must do it with the intent to eradicate this population. After Katz's statement, it will become much more difficult for the Israelis to claim that there is no genocidal intent.
According to Haaretz, by the way, the Israeli opposition newspaper, Israel seems to be creating a smokescreen around the true intentions of the government and the army. Exactly, you know. While waiting for news to talk with Hamas, there are preparations reportedly underway for a major operation to occupy the Gaza Strip. Is this something that seems to you?
I believe I am no longer in the right. You are right. We must be extremely precise when terms like genocide are used. But there is no doubt today. I have been convinced for a long time that the objective, because I have seen documents, you have seen them too, internal to Likud and the government, which set as the main objective to empty Gaza of its population.
And those are documents that date from November 2023. Right? So 6 weeks after.
That I obtained from you, I remember. It was extremely shocking. And then we remember the Trump proposals, you know, also to create a Monaco, a Riviera in Gaza, etc. No, I mean, it's obvious that the Israelis want to empty Gaza of its inhabitants, to take it back, quite simply. And,
yes, but no, you cannot say reclaim to take it
back, sorry.
Because they never...
But they occupied it somehow. Settlers, some settlers, yes, exactly, totally agree. No, to take it, absolutely.
Even in biblical times, Goliath was a Philistine, right? But even in biblical times, the Jews were not in Gaza.
It wasn't in one of the kingdoms of Israel, no. No, it's the question. So your question, we sink into our chairs when we hear, because it's so hopeless, it's so unbelievable. I mean, I was in Israel before you. It was the second Intifada. It was still, there had been, shortly after, there was Oslo. Shortly after there was Oslo, there was still a certain optimism. When I left Israel, I said goodbye to my Palestinian and Israeli friends by telling them, you are about to find something, to find a solution. At that time, we were already talking a lot about two states, of course. But already, I remember with some Palestinian intellectuals in particular, they told me, there will be two states, it's not possible. We must now fight for one state, a democratic state. Obviously, that complicates things a lot, but in any case, I think that the hardliners, the Netanyahus, and those even worse than him, have made the two-state solution impossible, in my opinion. So, on the table, there's only the one-state solution left. And the one-state solution...
No, but the solution of a one-state with equal rights for everyone seems even more illusory to me than the two-state solution. I think the natural course of things leans towards a pure and simple ethnic cleansing.
But who will be allowed to do it?
You see who is capable of reacting to that.
There would be the United States, but that is not their current position, actually.
You're also speaking about Transjordan, because in Transjordan there are also things happening. The West Bank, which are not nice.
I meant to say, it is not only in Gaza that there is an increase in repression, it is also in West Bank.
And then before, let's say, the straightforward ethnic cleansing, the intermediate step is to confine the Palestinians in types of Bantustans or Indian reservations, surrounded by settlers and armies, where they are in a kind of large prison, like Gaza was, but a bit smaller. And then the pressure. With the pressure, because when we live like that in an enclave, completely surrounded by the Israelis, it means we cannot trade, we cannot move, there is no foreign investment. People always say Hamas should have developed Gaza economically instead of building tunnels. But how can you develop Gaza when there is no freedom of trade, when there is no freedom of movement? You won't have a foreign company going to set up 1 franc or 1 cent in this open-air prison, as Sarkozy already described it almost 15 years ago.
Before experiencing the real prison, Sarkozy.
So the natural slope of things, it leads to that, to ethnic cleansing, with perhaps an intermediate stage that will be Indian reserves or Bantustans. And it's the attention of the people who are in power today and who are even supported, probably after the terrible shock of October 7th, by a majority of the population who say, we will never be able to live with these Palestinians around us.
There are still radicalized forces on both sides. There is a very strong far right in Israel, which also leads to radicalization, indeed, on the side of China.
I don't know who is causing the others' radicalization, because you have Palestinian movements that didn't need the Israeli far right to already reject the very prospect of an Israeli state. Already there was Yasser Arafat, etc. So it's not particularly new.
And in the Israeli camp, we have these neo-Nazis. They present themselves as such, or even in Reds, they talk about them as neo-Nazi ministers.
I don't really like this word Nazi.
No, but it's not, I am quoting them.
But the idea of an Israeli state with immense Jewish domination, it's not new. It dates back to Jabotinsky, to Ben-Gurion. It dates back to the very founding of the State of Israel. Maybe we should not forget that about 3/4, between 2/3 and 3/4 of the Arab Palestinian population of what constitutes Israel today, 750,000 people were deported or expelled during the War of 48, 49. This is what the Palestinians call the Nakba. So this idea of an immense Jewish majority over the entire territory, it is not new at all. And now they see the opportunity to implement this plan, ethnic cleansing. The person who passed me this humanitarian relocation plan, as they called it, he told me, this time it's the opportunity. This time we'll make it. Listen, we'll make it. We'll start with Gaza. Then we'll take care of the West Bank. We can't live with these people, but they have a problem. Who is going to host them? We're talking about 5 million Palestinians. Already 2.2 million probably remain, or 2.1 million remain in Gaza, and then 3 million in the West Bank. The Egyptians, the Jordanians, it would be extremely destabilizing for these two countries. So, who? Obviously, the guy from Likud said to me, yeah, we know the Egyptians and the Jordanians won't be able to take them all in. That's why we've thought about other countries. And you, Switzerland, 75,000, is that okay with you? 75,000, you'll accept them gladly, right? If it's to make us happy. So I didn't give him much hope, but who knows? Who knows what could happen with this parliament and this government?
Could you go back to the tensions between Netanyahu and the country's court judge? There were issues. There were also tensions within Israel even before the 7th of October. Do you think that played a role, in your opinion, in what is happening now in the beginning of...
There is still a headlong rush on the part of Netanyahu in the war?
Yes, but I think it's for another... All this is part of the same fight for Netanyahu to avoid prison.
He is on the razor's edge, that's for sure.
There you go. There are two things. The first thing, and this, there's been a long battle to take control of the judiciary, by ensuring a majority in the committee that appoints judges to the Supreme Court. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that as long as the war continues, well, his position is not threatened.
He risks nothing, yeah.
There you have it. So that's why we have struggling to understand the resumption of bombings in Gaza, which condemns the hostages, because we must perhaps not forget that the military objectives, when Israel launched its offensive at the end of 2023, were one, to destroy Hamas. Apparently, Hamas has as many personnel today as in October 2023 because they have recruited new people, around 25,000 members. And then secondly, to release the hostages. So what we saw was that the only way to release the hostages was through an agreement with Hamas. And there was a moment of hope because as soon as Trump came to power, he succeeded to accept this ceasefire agreement, providing for the release of the hostages even the day before he came to power by Netanyahu. It was his special envoy Witkoff who went to Jerusalem on a Saturday morning, the Sabbath day, when one never works.
Who gave him the order to come see him.
And then who said, no, I don't care about your Shabbat. To help you, I'm also doing Witkoff. Now you go out and I want to talk to you, and I don't know what is said. God knows what they said to each other. But all of a sudden, the agreement not only was accepted, but it was also implemented. And then so there were prisoner exchanges. It was put in place. And then the second part of the agreement, the second phase provided for a resumption of negotiations to discuss a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. And the Israelis, especially Netanyahu, entered this negotiation really reluctantly because he knew his far-right allies told him that if there is a withdrawal, we will leave your government, so the government risks falling, leading to new elections, and thus the prospect of trial and prison for Netanyahu. And that's where he preferred war. But that's also where Trump gave him the green light.
That's it? Because ultimately, what is Trump's policy? Well, in any case, Trump's objectives?
Well, there was a change, a sudden turnaround. What's up? Well, just when the bombing started, a bit before. Because we found out, what was it? A month ago, I think. We learned that for the first time since 1997, Trump, the American government, had sent emissaries to hold official talks with Hamas. It was around the same time that Switzerland decided to ban Hamas. The Americans, the Trump administration, were resuming official contacts with Hamas. When the Israelis learned this, they were on the verge of apoplexy, as one can imagine, because they had not been kept aware. And this Israeli American emissary named Bieler gave interviews to the Israeli press where he once again shocked the Israelis by saying, yes, but these Hamas guys, we can do business with them, they're perfectly fine. And well, we didn't tell the Israelis because we're not agents of Israel. Well, that was obviously too much for all the Israeli lobbies in Washington. And immediately after, there is a complete reversal of Trump's policy. So one can imagine that the donors, the people who have influence over Trump, he did borrow $100 million for his campaign from Miriam Adelsund. Isis Sato, who is very close to Netanyahu, who is the widow of a Las Vegas casino magnate, who has a lot of money, and is very, very, very close to Netanyahu. So we can imagine there were quite strong influences. And then Trump said, stop, we're stopping. This Bieler was sidelined. And then not only did they give the green light to the Israelis to resume massive bombings on Gaza, and they were also supplied with bombs. And then, roughly in parallel to that, the Americans resumed their bombings. Well, started a bombing campaign on their own this time, on the Houthis in Yemen. And the third element, they are assembling a spectacular armada around Iran. You have a second aircraft carrier with all the ships that go with it, which is on its way to the region. There are B-2 bombers, which are a sort of updated version of the B-52s that have been deployed to the Diego Garcia base, and other weapon systems already in place.
A new war in preparation.
Tensions are rising. So there could be a fairly massive operation being prepared against Iran. And then, for that matter, Trump even threatened, because he proposed a resumption of discussions bilaterally between Americans and Iranians. And Ayatollah Khamenei responded in somewhat vaguely by saying, yes, contacts, why not? But rather indirect, because we don't trust you, because it was you who exited the nuclear agreement during your first mandate. So all this might just be posturing to pressure the Iranians. The Iranians on their side say they have armed their missiles. They reportedly deployed missiles on 2 islands in the Persian Gulf, from which it's very easy to reach American bases and oil facilities.
Saudi,
Qatari, and Emirati. So there's a big hardening there, and we'll see in the coming weeks, but there's a risk of escalation with quite unpredictable consequences. Because that means we could have a barrel of oil at $200, potentially, or even more. So I think we must see all this in that context. Israeli, Iranian. And I no longer understand Trump's policy, because for a long time it seemed like he had a Riviera-style discourse to please Netanyahu. But underneath, he did the right things. That is to say, negotiate, discuss, make progress in implementing an agreement. And then there, since the Bueller Hamas episode, he completely reversed. And there, we are bombing everywhere. We're bombing in Syria, bombing in Lebanon, bombing in Yemen, bombing in Gaza, without really seeing what the objective is, what the plan is, what the strategy is. Do you see it better than I do?
No. But once again, those who hold the keys in the Middle East are Israel, it's obvious, but it's the United States. It's the United States. I remember that in the 90s, after the Gulf War, the Pax Americana, the Madrid Conference, etc. There was a window of opportunity, as we said, James Baker, who withheld billions that were intended for the American army, but they really, the United States, like never before in American-Israeli history, put pressure to force the Israelis to go in the direction they wanted. I remember that at the time I had met an American master's student, an American Jew, who was doing a master's and who said that the worst enemy of Israel was the United States, who was like a father who had given all the credit cards to his teenage son because he no longer wanted to see him saying, do whatever you want, but get off my back. And that was the worst way to help Israel. Israel needed a patriarch, of someone to keep it on the right track. All that went off course. Now we are in a situation that is a huge tragedy. And finally, sometimes I tell myself, the only thing that could happen in favor of Israel would be what I believe Jeffrey Sachs, in his speech at the European Parliament, mentioned like this at the end, saying that what we witnessed in relation to Ukraine, that is a complete overturning of the table in the Oval Office of the White House. Trump overturned the kick in the anthill and all that. It is not excluded that he might do it once in Israel too. But what you just said shows
it's more that he did it the other way around.
The other way around. But Trump is Trump. I think he hasn't forgotten the idea of having, if he manages to achieve peace in Ukraine, the Nobel Peace Prize somehow. And it's true that if he is able to free himself from this American Jewish lobby, which is indeed powerful, we know it. Everyone. And he says to himself, I will make peace in the Middle East. He might be capable of turning against Netanyahu like he did against Zelensky. It may not be excluded, but ultimately, apart from a complete reversal of the situation in the United States, in Washington, frankly, it feels like everything negative has been done and it continues in the same direction because ultimately, I was always convinced that the best protection, the best security for Israel was to be accepted by the neighboring states, by the environment in which they are located. Yet, they have everything. In their behavior, they show that they are a European colony in the Middle East. When Netanyahu was number 2 at the Foreign Affairs and was already telling us, but we cannot live with these Arabs around, etc. We were with our Secretary of State, Jacobi, on the Golan. Here too, he takes his Swiss colleague to an occupied territory without telling him.
Did you go there?
Yes, we were put into cars. We no longer had a choice. We arrived on the Golan. And then Netanyahu, number 2 at Foreign Affairs, says to him, but my dear Swiss colleague, do you see the Mediterranean? Then our Secretary of State says, yes, I see it very well. Do you understand why we are not going to give back even a square centimeter of this territory? We are too close, etc. I mean, no, we have a situation that goes beyond all comprehension. No one sees a solution anymore. Our countries keep talking about the two-state solution, etc. We have a minister, as you said, who is an echo chamber of Israeli foreign policy. We have a parliament that is largely under Israel's influence. Western countries, as soon as something happens regarding Israel, they are paralyzed. You see it too. In Germany, they don't dare to do anything anymore. Even in France, etc. There's Spain.
Spain, Belgium, and
who
Ireland.
let their music be heard.
Belgium and Ireland.
Curiously, that's true. But apart from that, the West as a whole does not help Israel by supporting it in all its excesses. And frankly, obviously, Switzerland, we got involved by having this Hamas law. Our parliament, clearly it says, does not like the Palestinians. That's its right. But we don't conduct foreign policy like that. And above all, we don't put ourselves in a position to be useful by excluding ourselves, by stepping out of the Middle Eastern game. And it's a real shame. It hasn't always been like that in Switzerland.
And besides, you can prove it.
Is the emerging conflict between Iran and the United States, you were talking about aircraft carriers, etc. Could it spell the end of peace in Ukraine?
Given that the Russians support the Iranians.
The Russians just had positioned themselves as intermediaries between the United States and Iran. At one point, there was talk about that path.
Switzerland is still offering good offices.
No, we are the postman between Iran and the United States.
But when they have serious messages to convey, they go through the Emirates.
Yes.
Yes, but it is a good question, you know, because there is obviously a transfer effect also between Ukraine and Iran. I am not too sure here. I think that the Russians will support Iran in case of an American attack, but support...
Verbally?
Yes, even by providing equipment, but discreetly.
China too, probably.
And probably China too. From the Russian and Chinese point of view, it's not uninteresting because they see this as further weakening the credibility of the West in the world. And in that case, I don't want to say they'll attract them, but I think they're in a win-win situation, the Chinese and the Russians, so they don't have too much to worry about. Now, if the price of oil goes up, it's not good for the Chinese, but it's not good for the Americans either, and it's very good for the Russians. There you go. So I still hope that we are just in a posturing logic. Afterwards, the Russians will not... It is not in the Russian mentality to cease all contact with the Americans on Ukraine because the Americans would bomb Iran. They will say, this is not good, it's aggression, etc. But the Russians have other interests with Washington, and then they can very well sequence questions. That is somewhat typical of major powers, that one can be allies on certain issues and enemies on others, while continuing to have perfectly cordial relations. It is only we who, let's say Putin is our enemy, we cannot have relations with him. Is he the devil?
Limited bombings in Iran, like with the tools, but I don't see a war somewhat like the war against Iraq, organized first. First, it is prepared, and they do not prepare, these would be strikes. Strikes.
So the declared military objective would be to destroy Iran's nuclear capability and missile capabilities, for example. But is that a realistic objective? From what I read, from what I hear, it doesn't seem to be the case. But well, and I don't see, there is a lot of information in all directions.
I still believe that Trump, he is one of the few presidents who had not declared war. Well, he did make a few strikes now, that's certain, but I do not believe that war is something he enjoys.
Let's say that what is happening with the Houthis now, it strikes. That's right.
But from a perspective...
Obama did that, they've all done that. I mean, it's not particularly new.
But, I mean, it also largely goes under the radar. Frankly, it's terrible to say, but I mean, who interests the tools in the West or in the United States?
The only thing that interests the Americans is that the operation plans were revealed on Signal, especially by including a journalist in the group.
Which was still something mind-blowing.
I don't feel like it's a mistake. Now, who benefits from the crime, all that, I'm not sure.
The White House did confirm nonetheless. There were various communications, and the journalist himself was surprised.
Yes, it seems that the security advisor is no longer in good standing either. Mike Walsh at the White House. I think that Trump and Putin are so close now that I get confused.
But in any case, in this group, Trump was absent, and it seems that everything was decided a bit. Without him, he gave his approval, but he was not aware of all the discussions.
He may have delegated.
Yes, but everyone is focusing on that, but forgetting the essential. The essential question is what these strikes are meant for. And also, are we talking about civilian casualties? Nobody is interested, and then I don't know. When I was at university, I learned that there was something called the War Powers Act, and that an American president did not have the right to start a war without consultation or even approval from Congress. But now it feels like, where are the democratic mechanisms? But anyway, he's not the first. Others have done this before him.
Georges Martin, Jean-Daniel Roure, we are reaching the end of this interview. As you know, we usually end with an open mic for our guests. If you have anything else to add.
Jean-Daniel?
Me? I always have something to add. Listen, I would really like to see a surge. I would like to see a European surge. I can't really count on that. But I would especially like to see a Swiss awakening. The vote of the Council of States on UNRWA is still a positive signal. We will have, as of these days, a new Minister of Defense who is still a colonel in the army, so he must know what leadership is. So I hope, I express wishes for the Swiss ship to be put back on a course that aligns with its traditions, values, and interests, always steering towards a neutral position, a position of to have good relations, to try to have good relations with everyone. Because it seems to me that's what made Switzerland's strength and soft power in the past, and it can continue in the future.
I am very close to what Jean-Daniel said. The European awakening, I do not believe in it, honestly not. There might be a European army once, but at 10 years or 20 years, we'll see. However, we are Swiss, and what I want is a Swiss awakening, because for 5 or 6 years, Switzerland has disappeared from most radars of international politics. I still remember a time when foreign countries regularly came to us for briefings on meetings with Hamas, but also on many other things, like our peace operations in Colombia, in the Sahel and Southeast Asia, at Shea, etc. We were active, we did things, we had a peace policy, as we called it at the time, and now I tell journalists, but go ask our division that is supposed to carry out these operations what it is doing. And I know that some journalists went there. There was no answer because, quite simply, we do not do practically nothing anymore. The budgets have disappeared, and it is no longer a priority at all. But it's not just in this area, it's in all areas. We have a strength that is extraordinary. It was our neutrality. And as Jean-Daniel said, everywhere in the world, we are recognized as a neutral country, a bit like the mother of all neutralities. And even with that, we are in the process of doing some dismantling. Do we have something? Are we lucky to have something? Well, no. We have architects or people who write our foreign policy, but for security, it's the same thing. They are people who don't want to base it on our strengths and who instead want to lead us into an organization of losers, as you said, towards an organization like NATO, to name it, which absolutely does not offer the guarantees it should offer. I usually say that by becoming a member of NATO, Switzerland automatically becomes a target. We have a target. Whereas if we continue with our policy of neutrality, and maybe I end my free hand by wishing for a redefinition of this neutrality, first we must allow it to survive, and then we must redefine it. We must give it back some content. It is not a neutrality synonymous with cowardice, a neutrality that allows us not to speak on the conflicts stirring the planet. On the contrary, it's a neutrality that we talked with Jean-Daniel about this. I mean, it's a neutrality that would federate not other neutral countries, not necessarily non-aligned countries, but all the countries that have chosen peace over confrontation at the international level. And there would be much to do. And I am very, very sad to see that Switzerland, which had an aura, which had meaning, which had a word that was recognized in the world, well, it has simply turned off the microphones and is no longer speaking out. It doesn't even condemn human rights violations or humanitarian law violations in the Middle East and elsewhere. And that I find very, very, very regrettable. We often say, as you mentioned, that ministries in Switzerland are very separate from each other. And I also think that the leaders of those ministries, particularly in the field of security and foreign policy, have an important role to play. And very often, if things no longer work, if we disappear from those screens, it's because of the failures of those heads. And that, I hope, will change with the head of defense. I also hope that soon we will have a new head of international relations, of foreign policy. Things are never hopeless. You must always keep hope in any case.
Georges Martin, Jean-Daniel Ruch, thank you for this interview.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation.